Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we're returning to an isolated Bavarian farm where the most terrifying part of the story may not be the murders themselves, but the days leading up to them.
Yeah, it truly is just a study in atmospheric creeping dread. I mean, when we look back at the landscape of this crime.
Yeah, brutal 1922 winter.
Exactly. The physical isolation in those deep Bavarian woods is just absolute. But the element that really embeds itself in your psyche is the realization that this family sanctuary was entirely compromised, entirely violated, long before a single act of physical violence took place.
Right, the predator was already inside the perimeter.
They were, and that's what makes it so chilling.
I mean, imagine waking up on this freezing, bone-chilling morning. You look out the frosted window and you see fresh footprints in the snow.
Mm-hmm.
They emerge from the dark, dense tree line, and they lead directly to your front door. But as you scan the rest of the pristine, snow-covered yard, there are no footprints leading away.
Right, so whoever made those tracks didn't leave.
Exactly. They are still inside your home with you. So our mission for this exploration today is to examine the infamous Hinterkaifeck murders, sift through over a century of rumors, historical records, and modern behavioral profiling.
And determine how an intruder managed to actually live inside the walls of a working farm before systematically dismantling the family that lived there.
Right, because to understand the ghosts that haunted this family, we first have to walk through the isolated fortress they called home.
And that fortress is arguably the most critical piece of forensic evidence we have. The geography of the farmstead basically dictates everything about how this crime was executed.
So we're traveling to a region roughly 43 miles north of Munich, Germany. The farmstead itself is called Hinterkaifeck.
Which translates to behind the town of Kaifeck.
Yeah, exactly. It's tucked away in this really dense forestry, completely removed from the closest village, which is Groburn. And living on this highly successful farm is the Gruber family.
And we really need to contextualize their success because it plays a massive role in the theories we'll explore later. It's 1922.
Right, so post-World War I.
Yeah, the Weimar Republic is in its infancy. They're still reeling from the devastating economic and human toll of the war. Hyperinflation is, really beginning to shadow the country. Trust in centralized banks is just at an all-time low.
So successful rural farmers like the Grubers aren't keeping their money in a vault in Munich.
No, not at all. They kept gold, silver, precious coins hidden directly on the property. They were essentially living in a highly isolated, self-sustaining bank.
Wow. That economic backdrop definitely makes the eventual crime scene even more bizarre. But let's look at the inhabitants of this rural bank. The patriarch is Andreas Gruber, who's 63 years old.
Mm-hmm.
His wife, Cecilia, is 72. Living with them is their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's two young children. There's 7-year-old Cecilia and a 2-year-old toddler named Joseph. And rounding out the household is this 44-year-old maid, Maria Baumgartner. And her story is particularly tragic.
It really is.
Because she arrived at the farm on the afternoon of Friday, March 31st. Literally, her very first day on the job was the day she was murdered.
Yeah, it's just horrific timing. And to understand how 6 people could be, systematically executed without a single neighbor hearing a scream, we really have to look at the architecture of the Hinterkaifeck farm.
Okay.
It was built in a traditional Bavarian style known as an Einfahrsthof.
Which basically means one roof house, right?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
It is this highly efficient, sprawling architectural design where the entire property is contained under one continuous massive roof.
Wow, okay.
For the family's residential living quarters, the internal kitchen, the animal stables for the cattle and pigs, the machine room, and the sprawling hay barn.
They're all connected?
All interconnected, yeah.
I mean, I imagine that's incredibly practical for a harsh Bavarian winter. Like if a blizzard hits, you never have to step foot outside into the freezing wind to feed the cows or repair a tool.
Right. You just walk through a series of internal wooden doors. And the heat from the livestock actually helps warm the living quarters. And the sheer mass of the hay in the barn acts as insulation.
That's fascinating. So it's a marvel of agricultural engineering?
It is, for survival against the elements. But from a security standpoint,
Oh, I see where this is going.
yeah, it creates a catastrophic vulnerability. Because the interconnected nature of the Einfursthof means that if an intruder successfully breaches just one external access point,
Like a loose door in the barn or a window.
exactly, say a window in the machine room, they instantly gain covert internal access to the entire property. They can move from the hayloft to the stables. They can listen to the family in the kitchen.
All without ever exposing themselves to the outside world.
Right. They become part of the farm's internal ecosystem, completely shielded from the road or the distant neighbors.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the terrifying sequence of events leading up to the murders. And the historical records here, they're drawn entirely from witness statements of the villagers who spoke to Andreas Gruber in his final days. They paint a picture of a house slowly descending into paranoia. Because 6 months before the murders, the family's previous maid, Kristen's Reger, abruptly packed her bags and fled.
And she didn't leave because the work was too hard.
No, she left because she believed to her core that the farm was haunted. She reported hearing these heavy phantom footsteps pacing in the attic above her bedroom late at night.
Yeah, and she told the Gruber she constantly felt the physical sensation of being watched from the shadows of the barn.
Which is just terrifying. But Andreas Gruber was a notoriously stern, unforgiving pragmatist, right?
Oh, absolutely. He initially dismissed her terror entirely. He attributed the noises to, the settling of old timber or heavy winter winds coming off the tree line.
Or rats in the hayloft.
Oh, right. But as the winter deepened into March of 1922, the anomalous events escalated to a point where even Andreas could no longer wave them away as mere superstition.
Because the physical evidence started manifesting. First, Andreas finds a newspaper sitting inside the property.
Yeah.
But it's not a local paper.
No, it's a newspaper from Munich.
Right. And nobody in the Gruber family had been to Munich recently. None of their neighbors in the village subscribed to this specific publication. It was simply left on the property.
Almost like an arrogant calling card from a phantom guest. And the newspaper is a vital psychological clue here.
How so?
Well, it implies the intruder was comfortable enough to bring reading material into the space. They weren't just passing through, they were occupying the farm.
Oh, well, yeah. That means they're settling in.
Exactly. And soon after that, a set of house keys vanishes from Andreas's desk. Now, in a closed rural system like Hinterkaifeck, keys don't just walk away.
The perimeter was actively being breached.
Yes.
And then comes the detail we opened with. Just days before the massacre, Andreas is surveying the property after a fresh snowfall. He finds the footprints.
Right.
They emerge from the edge of the forest, cross the open yard, and terminate directly at the broken lock of the machine room door. And there's 0 tracks leading back out into the snow.
Which is just chilling.
Right.
And we also have to consider the biological alarms that were ringing throughout the property. The livestock began acting highly erratically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The cows in the stable became inexplicably restless, vocalizing loudly throughout the night. One of the cows even managed to escape its stall, despite Andreas swearing he had securely fastened the heavy ropes.
Because animals possess an acute sensitivity to unfamiliar scents, micro-vibrations, changes in routine.
Right. Their agitation was a massive blaring siren that a stranger had introduced a new predatory scent into their enclosed environment.
And the psychological toll of this invisible intruder was absolutely tearing the family apart. The tension reaches a breaking point on Thursday, March 30th, so this is the night before the murders. Victoria Gabriel actually flees the house. She runs out into the freezing, pitch-black woods after a violently loud argument with her parents, screaming that someone is watching her, that someone is chasing her through the trees.
It's pure panic.
The family has to spend hours in the dark trying to track her down and bring her back inside. And then the next day, Friday, young 7-year-old Cecilia is so exhausted from the trauma of the previous night that she falls asleep at her desk in the village school.
It is the clinical portrait of a family operating under extreme, debilitating psychological duress. I mean, they are sleep deprived, their adrenal systems are completely drained.
They are acutely aware that their sanctuary is no longer safe.
Exactly.
And this is where we have to pause and analyze the psychology of Andreas Gruber, because honestly, it's baffling. He has one-way footprints leading into his machine room. He has missing keys. His livestock are panicking. His daughter is running into the woods screaming about a watcher. He literally goes to the local tavern and tells his neighbors all of these things. A neighbor is so alarmed that he offers to lend Andreas a firearm for protection.
And Andreas flat out refuses.
He declines the gun, and he refuses to contact the local police.
Why? To modern sensibilities, it seems like a deliberate death wish, right?
Possibly. It makes no sense.
But behavioral science offers a profound explanation for this inaction, and it's called normalcy bias. The human brain is a pattern-seeking organ that desperately wants to maintain the status quo.
Okay.
When confronted with an unprecedented, catastrophic threat like, the very real possibility of a murderer nesting in the ceiling above your family, the reality is simply too horrifying for the conscious mind to process.
So it just rejects it.
Exactly. It downplays the threat to protect itself from psychological collapse.
I always think of normalcy bias like a computer going into safe mode.
Mm-hmm.
When a computer encounters a catastrophic system error that it can't resolve, it doesn't just explode.
Yeah.
It shuts down all the complex, high-level processing and boots up, relying only on the most basic, familiar, bare-bones routines to keep the machine running.
That is an incredibly accurate way to frame it.
Andreas's brain encountered a catastrophic error footprints with no exit. So instead of processing that highly complex, terrifying threat, his brain went into safe mode. He reverted to his basic routines: check the locks, feed the cows, fix the tractor.
He forced the anomalous data to fit a non-lethal narrative. He convinced himself the postman accidentally dropped the newspaper and that the footprints were just a confused hunter passing through.
Wow.
And furthermore, Andreas Gruber's specific safe mode was deeply tied to his tyrannical need for control. He was an incredibly harsh, dictatorial patriarch who ruled his farm with an iron fist.
He also had a criminal record, right?
He did, which we will dissect later, and he aggressively isolated his family from the surrounding village. When you've spent your entire life viewing your neighbors with suspicion and local authorities as adversaries, you simply do not invite them onto your land.
So to ask for help or to accept the neighbor's gun would be to admit that he was no longer the apex predator on his own property.
Exactly. His ego and his normalcy bias formed a fatal combination.
Which brings us to the evening of Friday, March 31st. The unseen watcher finally decides to step out of the shadows. And the spatial geography we discussed earlier, the Einverstoff architecture, was explicitly weaponized against the Grubers.
It was. The spatial analysis of the attack is horrifying in its efficiency. The killer didn't mount a chaotic, loud home invasion through the front door.
No.
They utilized the internal corridors. The forensic evidence clearly indicates that the killer lured the victims one by one from the relative safety of the residential living quarters through the internal stable and into the dark, heavy timbered barn.
And we don't know the exact bait used. Given the interconnected layout, it could have been as simple as the killer unlatching a cow's stall so the animal would bump against the wooden walls, creating a noise that required investigation.
Right.
But Andreas, his wife Sabalia, their daughter Victoria, and young 7-year-old Cecilia all walk into that barn sequentially. And waiting for them in the pitch black is someone holding a highly customized, devastating weapon.
Yes. And the murder weapon provides a startling window into the methodology of the offender. It was a mattock.
Okay, for those unfamiliar, a standard mattock is a heavy agricultural hand tool, similar to a pickaxe, right?
Yeah, it typically has an adze-like arched blade on one side for chopping roots or digging hard soil, and a pointed or flat end on the other. However, this specific mattock originally belonged to a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
And Andreas Gruber had stolen it from him years prior and brought it to Hinterkaifeck.
Exactly. But Andreas didn't just toss it in a shed, he re-engineered it. He turned a standard digging implement into a highly specialized slaughtering tool.
I want to walk through exactly how this thing was modified, because it dictates the entire forensic profile of the autopsies.
Let's do it.
Andreas used heavy iron clamps to reinforce the blade. Then he drilled through the head of the tool and drove a continuous 8mm threaded iron screw directly through the center, securing it tightly with locking nuts.
Right.
The screw protruded prominently outwards.
It's a grisly modification, but in the context of 1920s rural agriculture, it served a highly specific purpose. This was custom-built for the efficient slaughter of heavy livestock, primarily pigs.
Okay.
In traditional farm slaughter, you cannot simply bludgeon an animal haphazardly. If the animal panics and struggles, the influx of adrenaline and stress hormones will over-acidify the muscle tissue, rendering the meat tough and practically inedible.
Ah, so the kill must be instantaneous.
Exactly.
Right, so the design was biomechanical. Andreas would use the flat side of the heavy mattock to deliver a concussive strike to the animal's skull, stunning it instantly. Then, in one fluid motion, he would flip the heavy tool over and bring it down so that the protruding 8mm screw would penetrate the skull and pierce the brain, causing instant brain death.
Yes, and the locking nuts and flat guard around the base of the screw acted as a stopping mechanism. It ensured the screw went exactly deep enough to destroy the brain without completely shattering the skull casing.
Because every single part of the animal, including the brain matter, was harvested for food.
It's a dark, brutal reality of survival farming. But the absolute tragedy is that the killer used Andreas's own custom-engineered slaughter tool against his family, and they wielded it with terrifying, practiced proficiency.
Yeah, when Dr. Johann Baptist Müller, the court physician, conducted the autopsies, the findings revealed an extreme level of control.
This wasn't someone wildly swinging a heavy axe in the dark hoping to land a hit.
Not at all.
If an untrained individual attempts to swing a heavy, unbalanced agricultural tool with a protruding screw in the pitch black of an unfamiliar barn, they are going to make mistakes. They will strike glancing blows, they might bend the screw on a collarbone, or they might drop the weapon entirely due to the sheer kinetic force of the backswing.
But the killer struck with measured, lethal precision. Victoria Gabriel suffered 9 focused blows to the right side of her head. This is what forensic analysts term extreme overkill. Yet her skull was not entirely pulverized.
Exact.
Her mother, the elder Cecilia, suffered 8 similarly precise blows. The killer was utilizing the exact biomechanical technique, stun and penetrate, that the tool was designed for.
And the details of the autopsies are just heartbreaking. Victoria also presented with deep strangulation marks on her neck,
Which suggests the killer was operating in incredibly close quarters, physically subduing her or silencing her screams before the mattock was brought down.
But the forensic detail that is the most difficult to process is the fate of young 7-year-old Cecilia.
Oh, this part is awful.
Yes. Unlike her mother and grandparents, the child was not killed instantly.
The autopsy revealed she survived for at least 2 hours in the freezing hay of the barn, lying right next to the stacked bodies of her family. The sheer physical agony she was in is unfathomable.
She had torn her own hair out in clumps, clutching it in her fists.
The killer had smashed her jaw with a bloody iron band, likely to silence her cries, and ultimately her throat was slit with a small pocket knife.
It's horrific. And once the primary threat pool, the 4 conscious, mobile individuals in the barn were neutralized, the killer's behavior shifted. They didn't flee the property. They methodically breached the inner sanctum of the house.
Because of the Microsoft design, they simply walked from the blood-soaked barn through the quiet stable and into the kitchen.
They navigated to the maid's quarters. They found Maria Baumgartner, who had been on the farm for merely a few hours, and struck her through the skull as she lay in her bed.
God.
Finally, they entered Victoria's bedroom, approached the bassinet where 2-year-old Joseph was sleeping, and brought the mattock down with such immense force that the blade smashed completely through the protective roof of the pram, killing the infant instantly.
6 people meticulously eradicated. But within this dark sequence, Andreas Gruber's death presents a glaring forensic anomaly.
It does.
He was not killed in the same manner as the women. He didn't have the multiple precise puncture wounds from the mattock's screw.
This anomaly is crucial for understanding the chaotic reality of the timeline. Andreas suffered a single devastating wound. His right cheek was violently torn open down to the cheekbone, completely severing his carotid artery. He bled to death in a matter of minutes.
But the physical evidence strongly suggests that this wound was not caused by a swung blow from the customized mattock, right?
Exactly. The trajectory and shape of the wound indicate he fell or was violently shoved onto the sharp tip of a completely different standard pickaxe that was resting nearby in the animal feeding trough.
That drastically changes the narrative of the barn sequence. It suggests Andreas wasn't ambushed in the exact same manner as his wife and daughter.
No.
It points to a desperate, chaotic physical struggle in the dark. Or perhaps Andreas entered the barn at a different time, interrupting the killer while they were dealing with another victim, resulting in a frantic confrontation where he was pushed into the trough.
It completely shatters the idea of a perfectly executed silent sequence. But despite this chaotic interruption, the massacre was completed. And this is where we reach the behavioral anomaly that has obsessed criminal profilers for a century. The absolute most unsettling fact of the Hinterkaifeck case.
Right. Because if you or I imagine the psychology of someone who has just committed a mass murder of 6 people with heavy iron tools, we picture an individual vibrating with adrenaline, drowning in the panic of potential discovery.
The biological instinct is flight.
You drop the weapon, you run into the tree line, and you put as much distance between yourself and the corpses as possible. But the killer at Hinterkaifeck didn't run.
No, they moved in.
They stayed for days. From Saturday, April 1st through Monday, April 3rd, the killer actively occupied the crime scene. They lived among the dead. The neighbors in Groburn literally saw smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney over the weekend.
Whoever was inside was keeping the ovens warm to stave off the Bavarian winter. They went into the stables and systematically fed the cattle.
They took the family's watchdog. A Spitz tied it up near the bakehouse and ensured it had food and water.
They went into the Gruber's kitchen pantry, sliced fresh meat, and calmly ate the family's bread.
And we know definitively that this was not merely a brief, panicked pause to catch their breath. They adopted the domestic rituals of the family. In the kitchen, there's a traditional tear-off daily calendar on the wall.
Yeah.
Tearing off the previous day's sheet was a morning ritual, typically performed by the head of the household to mark the passage of time. When investigators eventually arrived, they found that the sheet for Friday, March 31st, had been meticulously torn off, revealing Saturday, April 1st.
It's not just staying, it's a terrifying act of usurpation. By updating that calendar, the killer is literally resetting the clock of the household to their own time. They are claiming ownership of the space.
There's even a witness statement that highlights how brazen this occupation was. An artisan named Michael Plucko was walking past the Hinterkaifeck farm on the night of April 1st.
Right.
He notices that the external bakehouse oven is fired up and roaring. This immediately strikes him as odd, because it was the completely wrong time of day for rural farmers to be baking bread. As he stops to look, he is suddenly blinded by a harsh lantern light. A mysterious figure is standing near the oven, holding the lantern up to obscure their face. The figure doesn't speak, doesn't threaten him. They just silently shine the light into Pluckel's eyes until he feels so unnerved that he runs away.
And Pluckle specifically noted that the air around the oven didn't smell like baking bread. It smelled intensely of burning rags.
Oh, wow.
When police later analyzed the scene, they deduced that the killer was utilizing the bakehouse oven to burn the victim's blood-soaked clothing. They were actively destroying forensic evidence while simultaneously managing the property's agricultural needs.
The level of deep psychopathy required to casually slice bread in the kitchen, sleep in the hayloft, and tend to cows while the decaying bodies of the owners are stacked just feet away behind a wooden door is almost impossible to quantify.
It requires a complete severing of human empathy.
Which finally brings us to the grisly discovery. It's now Tuesday, April 4th. The mail has been piling up at the post office. Young Cecilia has missed several days of school without explanation. The deeply religious family was entirely absent from Sunday Mass.
Yeah.
A mechanic named Albert Hoffner actually visited the farm to repair an engine. He spent 4 hours on the property, saw no one, heard the cows shifting in the stable, heard the dog barking, and then, assuming the family was just out in the field, he packed up his tools and left.
4 hours.
Finally, the neighbors in Groburn decide the silence has gone on too long. A search party is formed and is led by the very neighbor we mentioned earlier, Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
And the actions of Lorenz Schlittenbauer during this search are, from a modern investigative and forensic standpoint, an absolute nightmare.
Totally.
His behavior severely compromised the crime scene and fueled decades of suspicion.
It's a textbook example of how not to handle a discovery. The search party arrives at the farm. The exterior doors are locked. They eventually force their way into the heavy barn doors. And there, in the dark corner, they find the horror.
The bodies.
The bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia are stacked on top of each other. The killer had attempted to conceal the pile by throwing loose hay over them and dragging a heavy, detached wooden door over the bodies.
Right.
But the moment they find this mass grave, Schlittenbauer does something incredibly suspicious.
Instead of immediately freezing the scene, ordering the men out of the barn, and sending a rider to summon the Munich police, Schlittenbauer completely bypasses the rest of the shocked search party.
He just walks away from them.
He walks deliberately toward the internal door that connects the stable to the inner living quarters. Now, depending on which historical witness statement you analyze, the accounts diverge. Some men claim Schlittenbauer magically produced a key from his own pocket to unlock the door.
Perhaps the very key Andreas Gruber had reported missing days earlier.
Exactly. Other witnesses claim Schlittenbauer stated the key was already resting in the lock. Regardless of the mechanism, he opens the door, leaves the search party behind in the barn, and enters the dark house alone. He navigates directly to the bedrooms, where he alone discovers the bludgeoned bodies of the maid and the toddler, Josef.
And when the other men finally follow him inside and angrily ask him what he's doing, walking through a house full of murdered people, contaminating the floors, Schlittenbauer reportedly replies, "I am looking for my son."
Because it was an open, scandalous secret in the village of Grobern that Schlittenbauer had engaged in a long-standing affair with Victoria Gabriel. He firmly believed the murdered toddler Josef was his illegitimate child.
That belief provides a powerful emotional motive for him to frantically search the house. But the cost of the investigation was catastrophic. Because Hinterkaifeck was so remote, it took hours for the official police inspectors to arrive from Munich. During that agonizing delay, Schlittenbauer essentially gave impromptu walking tours of the slaughterhouse to a rapidly growing crowd of morbidly curious villagers. The bodies in the barn were shifted and touched. Items in the kitchen were moved.
The snowy courtyard was trampled by dozens of boots, completely obliterating any potential footprint evidence left by the killer.
It was the perfect storm of a botched investigation. The scene was irreparably contaminated before the authorities even arrived. And when the police finally did take control, they were completely out of their depth.
Forensic science in 1922 was still in its relative infancy, but the decisions made here border on the absurd.
They really do.
They had the court physician, Dr. Müller, perform the complex autopsies of 6 brutally murdered people right there in the barn, conducting delicate medical examinations, literally kneeling in the blood-soaked hay.
And then, in a move that sounds like it was ripped from a Victorian Gothic horror novel, the authorities decapitated all 6 victims. They packed the severed heads into wooden boxes and shipped them off to Munich.
And one might assume they sent the skulls for advanced ballistic or craniology analysis, but the reality is far more bizarre. The authorities, desperate for a lead in a case with no witnesses, handed the skulls over to local clairvoyants and psychics.
Wait, literally psychics?
Yes. Hoping these individuals could divine metaphysical clues from the bone structure. It is a stark, depressing reminder of the desperation and limitations of the era.
That is wild.
Tragically, those skulls were housed in a Munich building that was bombed by Allied forces during World War II. They were destroyed, meaning modern forensic anthropologists will never have the opportunity to examine the precise tool marks with 21st century technology.
So you take a crime scene of unprecedented brutality, you contaminate it heavily with a parade of intrusive neighbors, and you cap it off with an official investigation that prioritizes shipping heads to psychics over securing trace evidence.
Right.
It is absolutely no wonder that Hinterkaifeck created the perfect, fertile breeding ground for a century of wild, elaborate theories. We really have to explore the internet's favorite theories and the cultural interpretations of this case. Because when you dive into the forums and the historical deep reads today, there is one theory that completely dominates the narrative: the attic intruder.
It dominates the conversation because, unlike many internet theories, this one is backed by undeniable physical historical evidence. The truth of the hidden intruder wasn't fully revealed until a year after the murders.
In 1923.
Right. The decision was made to demolish the Hinterkaifeck farmstead entirely. The land was considered cursed by the locals. And as the demolition crews arrive, tearing down the sprawling roof of the Einfursthof and pulling up the heavy floorboards, the secrets the killer left behind were finally exposed to the light.
They found the nest, and it is the most skin-crawling detail of the entire case.
Precisely. Up in the attic, nestled carefully within the false floorboards directly above the family's kitchen, the demolition workers found a meticulously constructed makeshift living space. Someone had gone to great lengths to lay down a thick, dense carpet of flattened hay.
Which wasn't for warmth, right?
No, it was explicitly designed to muffle the sound of their footsteps on the wooden floorboards so the family below wouldn't hear them pacing.
Wow, that's so creepy.
The intruder had strategically removed several specific roof tiles, creating a hidden sniper's lookout that provided a clear, unobstructed view of the entire courtyard and the main road, allowing them to watch for approaching police or neighbors.
The preparation is what makes it so terrifying. They found thick ropes tightly tied to the heavy structural beams of the roof, positioned so that the intruder could quickly rappel or drop down directly into the hay barn below if they needed to make a rapid escape or initiate an ambush. Scattered around this hidden lookout, the workers found the rinds of smoked meat, showing exactly what the intruder was eating while they sat in the dark, watching the family operate below. And in a detail that truly confirms the extended occupation, they found accumulated human feces in the hayloft.
Yes.
The killer was indisputably living above the family, listening to their muffled conversations through the floorboards, breathing their air for an extended period before they ever struck.
Furthermore, the demolition revealed the ultimate proof: the murder weapons. Cleverly and securely concealed beneath the false floorboards, the workers found the heavy, modified mattock with the 8mm screw, the iron still heavily stained with the victim's blood.
Hidden alongside it was the bloody iron band used to smash young Cecilia's jaw, and Andreas Gruber's own pocket knife, which was used in her final moments.
The fact that the weapons were hidden with such considerable effort and risk completely refutes the idea of a panicked killer fleeing into the night. They methodically cleaned up the immediate scene and concealed their tools in an area only someone intimately familiar with the house's hidden architecture would utilize.
So we have the undeniable physical proof that someone was living in the walls. The million-dollar question remains: who was it? Let's thoroughly examine the prime local suspect, the man who led the search party, Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Let's do it.
When you look at the case files, the motive seems almost too cinematic. He was Victoria's former lover. He believed Joseph was his biological son. But Andreas Gruber, operating as the tyrannical patriarch, was furiously opposed to their relationship and aggressively interfered, essentially forbidding them from marrying.
There are historical rumors that Victoria was preparing to legally demand child support from Schlittenbauer. Lorenz had recently remarried and tragically lost an infant with his new wife. He may have been desperate to avoid the financial and social ruin of paying support to the Grubers.
The emotional and financial motives are certainly present. And as we discussed, his highly suspicious behavior during the discovery of the bodies, bypassing the group, producing a key, rearranging the scene, paints the picture of a man who is deeply, intimately familiar with the complex internal layout of the Einfursthof.
He navigated the dark farm like it was his own.
But as compelling as that sounds, we have to look at the exonerating logic, which is incredibly strong.
We do. If we apply objective deductive reasoning, the Schlittenbauer theory hits several massive roadblocks. First, we must return to the murder weapon. The mattock originally belonged to Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Right.
Andreas Gruber had stolen it. If Schlittenbauer is the mastermind killer planning a mass execution, why on earth would he choose to use a weapon that could be directly traced back to his own property?
Exactly. And even if he grabbed it in a crime of passion, why would he meticulously hide his own stolen mattock deep in the Gruber's attic, leave it there, and then not retrieve it when the farm sat entirely empty for a full year before the demolition? He didn't even volunteer to help the demolition crew tear the farm down. If he was the killer, he had to know the neighbors were eventually going to pull up those floorboards and find a bloody weapon with his distinct modifications or fingerprints on it.
And when they did find it, he reportedly pointed at it and said, "Hey, that's my mattock. It's been missing." He used it as proof of Andreas's thievery, not as a confession.
Beyond the logic of the weapon, there's the physical reality of the suspect. The Munich police at the time formally evaluated Schlittenbauer and concluded he suffered from severe chronic asthma.
The physical exertion required to systematically overpower 6 people, including a strong 63-year-old farmer like Andreas, drag heavy bodies into a pile, and swing a heavy iron tool with absolute sustained biomechanical precision. It demands incredible cardiovascular stamina.
Yeah.
The medical authorities simply did not believe his compromised lungs could withstand the sheer physical output of a mass slaughter.
The asthma and the weapon logic really force investigators to look outward, beyond the immediate village disputes. And this leads us to one of the more cinematic, almost unbelievable theories in the case files: the return of Carl Gabriel, Victoria's dead husband.
It is a theory steeped in the trauma and chaos of the post-World War I era. Carl Gabriel was drafted into the military and reportedly died in the muddy trenches of Arras, France, in December of 1914, during the very early, chaotic days of the First World War.
However, his body was never officially recovered and returned to the family. In the absence of a body, the rumor mill in rural Bavaria began to churn. Whispers suggested that Carl didn't die in that trench.
Right, that he deserted his post, hid out in the shadows of war-torn Europe, and eventually made his way back to Hinterkaifeck years later.
And when this ghost from the trenches arrives at his former home, what does he find? His wife, Victoria, has an illegitimate 2-year-old toddler. She is embroiled in a scandalous affair with the neighbor, Schlittenbauer. Even darker, there were persistent rumors in the village of ongoing incest between Victoria and her father, Andreas.
The theory posits that the immense shock and rage of this discovery caused the traumatized soldier to snap. Carl Gabriel would possess the exact knowledge required to execute this crime. He used to live at Hinterkaifeck.
He would know the Einfursthof architecture intimately.
He would know exactly how to navigate the blind spots, how to access the false floorboards in the attic, and how to utilize the farm tools. Interestingly, this theory gained massive traction after World War II.
Really? Why then?
There were numerous verified reports from German prisoners of war returning from Soviet gulags. These POWs claimed that during their captivity, a German-speaking Soviet officer had brutally interrogated them. During these sessions, the officer allegedly boasted that he was the true murderer of Hinterkaifeck, claiming he slaughtered the family as revenge.
Many amateur sleuths leaped to the conclusion that this mysterious, boastful Soviet officer was Carl Gabriel, who had defected to Russia, survived the decades, and risen through the ranks. Sounds like the plot of a dense espionage thriller.
It does, yeah.
But realistically, there is no hard documentary evidence that Carl survived 1914. His fellow soldiers provided sworn testimonies that they saw his body obliterated in a direct artillery strike. The trauma of war creates ghosts, but it rarely resurrects the dead.
True.
So let's pivot to the darkest theory involving the family itself, one that requires examining the horrific internal dynamics of the Grubers, the Andreas Gruber murder-suicide theory.
To objectively evaluate this theory, we must address the profoundly disturbing, verified criminal history of the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber was not just a strict, difficult patriarch. He was a convicted abuser.
Right.
In 1915, both Andreas and his daughter Victoria were arrested, tried, and formally convicted of incest. Andreas served a year in a state prison. Victoria served a month.
The local community of Grubern was acutely, uncomfortably aware of the abuse occurring behind the closed doors of the farm. Neighbors had previously considered reporting Andreas to the authorities for severe child abuse.
He was known to brutally beat his children, deliberately deny them food for days, and lock them in freezing root cellars as punishment. In fact, historical records indicate that one of his other daughters, Sophie, actually died as a direct result of his neglect and abuse.
So the environment inside that house was already an active nightmare long before any intruder arrived. The murder-suicide theory suggests that Andreas, who was pathologically possessive of Victoria, discovered undeniable proof that the toddler, Josef, was not his own son, but rather Lorenz Schlittenbauer's.
Driven by a blinding possessive rage, Andreas takes the attic, ambushes his wife, his daughter, the children, and the newly arrived maid. He massacres them.
Then, in a state of dissociative shock, he stays on the farm for a few days, wandering around in a daze, feeding his beloved cows, until someone else, perhaps Schlittenbauer coming to secretly check on Victoria, arrives, discovers the horrific massacre, and kills Andreas in retaliation, tossing him into the feeding trough.
The theory is compelling because it cleanly accounts for the bizarre post-defense residency. If Andreas committed the murders, of course he would stay and feed his own cattle. But when we apply rigorous forensic logic to the physical evidence, the theory shatters completely.
Exactly. We have to look at the clothing and the wounds. If Andreas was the architect of the slaughter, wandering the farm for days in a fugue state, why on earth was he found dead wearing his thin nightclothes, while his wife and daughter were found fully dressed in their heavy daytime work clothes?
If you are planning to go out to a freezing barn to execute your entire family, you don't do it in your pajamas.
Furthermore, how do we explain the mechanics of his fatal wound? Everyone else was methodically, purposefully struck with a Maddox penetrating screw. Andreas died from a severed carotid artery after falling onto a completely different, unmodified pickaxe.
The staging of the bodies, the attire, and the disparate sequence of the wounds point definitively to Andreas being a victim of a chaotic ambush, not the calculated mastermind of the slaughter. It is statistically and biomechanically highly improbable that a man who just executed 5 people with cold, calculated precision would accidentally trip and fatally sever his own neck on a different tool while wearing his nightgown.
So if we rule out the neighbor, the dead husband, and the patriarch, we are left with the terrifying prospect of a traveling predator. Let's examine the theories surrounding Paul Mueller and the Bichler brothers.
In recent years, crime historian Bill James proposed what is known as the man from the train theory. Through exhaustive archival research, he identified a German immigrant named Paul Mueller as a highly prolific, transient, serial axe murderer operating in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Mueller's modus operandi was terrifyingly specific. He targeted highly isolated farmhouses located near railroad tracks. He slaughtered entire families under the cover of darkness using blunt instruments found on the property.
He would meticulously cover the bodies with blankets or hay, and crucially, he often stayed at the crime scene for hours or days afterwards, making himself at home without stealing any significant valuables.
James hypothesizes that when law enforcement heat in the U.S. became too intense, Mueller fled back to his native Germany, and that the Hinterkaifeck murders perfectly match his distinct spatial and temporal profile.
The behavioral profile is a stunningly perfect match. The overkill, the blunt instrument of opportunity, covering the bodies, staying at the scene, ignoring the gold, it's all there. But linking a specific phantom American serial killer to a random Bavarian farm decades later is incredibly difficult to prove without modern DNA analysis.
Locally, the Munich police heavily investigated a duo known as the Bichler brothers and their associates, the Folklore brothers. The former maid, Kristen Reiger, the one who quit because of the phantom footsteps, actually gave their names to the police.
She testified that the brothers had previously worked as hired hands on the farm. They explicitly bragged to her about knowing exactly where Andreas Gruber hid his silver and gold, and she claimed they made menacing foreshadowing comments to the effect that the Gruber family ought to be dead.
They're known local burglars, and they certainly had the geographical knowledge of the farm to execute the intrusion. The police interrogated them extensively, but once again, the evidence was entirely circumstantial. No stolen wealth was found on them, and they provided alibis.
And discussing the maid's testimony brings up a vital point about how we consume historical true crime. We have to separate verified historical facts from internet lore. There is a massive, pervasive myth about this case that frequently goes viral on platforms like Reddit and YouTube, and we need to definitively debunk it.
Ah, yes, the secret diary. If you read about the Hinterkaifeck case online, you will inevitably stumble across a highly detailed post claiming that investigators discovered a secret diary hidden deep in the floorboards of the house. And this diary supposedly detailed the family's creeping, day-by-day terror. It allegedly reads like a found-footage horror movie script, documenting the exact dates the phantom footsteps started, how Andreas reacted to the missing keys, and the escalating panic of Victoria.
It is a phenomenal narrative device, but it is entirely unequivocally fabricated. There was no secret diary. No hidden journal was ever recovered from the property by the Munich police or the demolition crews.
The entire terrifying narrative of the prelude of terror, the footprints in the snow, the missing keys, the Munich newspaper, is derived solely from the verbal complaints Andreas Gruber made to his neighbors at the local tavern and in the village square in the days immediately preceding his death.
The internet has collectively romanticized and condensed these scattered witness statements into a tangible, spooky diary to make the story feel more cinematic. But the historical reality relies entirely on the fragile memories of the villagers who survived them.
And while the internet desperately loves a ghost story, or a resurrected WWI soldier creeping through the rafters, modern behavioral science offers an explanation that is far more grounded, and in my opinion, infinitely more terrifying. Let's shift our focus to our analysis and key takeaways. We need to look at how modern criminal profiling interprets this century-old mystery.
The first major analytical hurdle is revisiting the family's inaction through a modern psychological lens. The question everyone asks is, why didn't they run?
We discussed the computer safe mode analogy earlier, normalcy bias. Andreas prioritized his routine over the terrifying reality. But the layout of the land, the spatial geography we discussed, didn't just facilitate the murders, it isolated the screams.
Exactly. The Einverstoff architecture's role in the acoustic timeline of the murders is profound. Because the barn, the stables, and the living quarters were internally connected, the killer utilized the geography to create what tactical analysts call a fatal funnel. By isolating the victims in the dark, heavy timbered barn, the screams of the dying were completely muffled by the sheer mass of the hay and the thick wooden walls.
The ambient noise of the restless, distressed cattle in the adjacent stable provided an acoustic cover. This meant that the new maid, Maria, and the toddler, Joseph, sleeping just 50 feet away in the residential wing, had absolutely no idea their entire family was being brutally slaughtered.
The killer turned their architectural sanctuary into a soundproof slaughterhouse, entirely mitigating the risk of a scream carrying across the snow to the main road.
Which brings us back to the post-defense residency. We've dissected the brazenness of this choice to stay for days. But what does it actually tell a criminal profiler about the killer's internal state?
When an offender exhibits this extreme level of post-defense residency, it illuminates several critical facets of their psychology. First, it indicates an immense, almost arrogant spatial comfort. They are not intimidated by the environment, they feel they own it. Second, it suggests profound psychopathy, the rare ability to completely compartmentalize and detach emotionally from the grotesque reality of 6 decaying bodies located just behind a thin wooden door. But most importantly, staying at the scene to eat the family's food and tend their animals points to an expressive settlement of grievance.
Meaning this wasn't just a business transaction, it wasn't a hit, it was deeply personal.
Highly personal. We know definitively from the Munich police archives that this was not a financially motivated robbery. The investigators found thousands of marks in gold and silver coins left out in plain sight in unlocked wardrobes in the bedrooms. The killer literally walked past a fortune.
Instead of looting, they preferred to spend their valuable time meticulously prying up false floorboards to hide the murder weapons, standing by the oven burning blood-soaked clothes, and systematically feeding the cows.
They didn't want the family's wealth. They wanted to symbolically reclaim or inhabit the family's space. They wanted to sit at Andreas Gruber's heavy wooden table, eat his bread, and play the role of the undisputed master of the farm.
That concept of usurpation is bone-chilling. It's the ultimate violation. The killer isn't just terminating your life. They are trying on your daily existence to see how it fits. It makes you wonder if modern law enforcement could have cracked this case if they had access to the scene before the neighbors trampled it.
And actually, they tried. Let's examine the monumental cold case review that occurred in 2007.
Yes, 85 years after the murders, the students and instructors at the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy decided to fully re-examine the Hinterkaifeck case using modern investigative technology. They applied 21st century behavioral analysis, advanced criminal profiling, and sophisticated forensic spatial mapping to all the surviving historical documents, witness statements, and the gruesome crime scene photographs.
Right.
How exactly did they apply modern spatial mapping to a farm that was demolished in 1923?
It was a massive undertaking. The Academy utilized advanced CAD software computer-aided design to painstakingly build a complete 3D digital replica of the Hinterkaifeck Einverstoff based on historical blueprints and photographs.
Oh, wow.
Once they had this digital environment, they could perform line-of-sight analyses. They could virtually sit in the killer's nest in the attic and prove exactly what parts of the courtyard and road were visible through the removed roof tiles.
That's incredible.
They could digitally map the blood spatter patterns seen in the old photographs to reconstruct the exact swing trajectories of the mattock. They profiled the killer's necessary familiarity with the farm's layout, determining that the offender absolutely had to have prior intimate knowledge of the structure to navigate it silently in the dark.
And the result of all this high-tech analysis, they actually solved it. Well, sort of. The Academy students and their seasoned instructors successfully agreed on a unified theory of the crime. They unanimously identified a single primary suspect who perfectly fit all the complex behavioral, geographic, and temporal profiles they had constructed.
But here is the incredibly frustrating twist that drives true crime researchers to distraction. The Academy published their comprehensive, hundreds of pages long report, but they explicitly, firmly refused to publicly name the suspect they had identified.
It's maddening.
Yeah.
Why go through all that effort just to keep it a secret?
They stated that their decision was purely ethical, out of respect for the living descendants of the perpetrator, who still live in the Bavarian region today and bear absolutely no guilt for the horrific crimes of their ancestor. The Academy chose not to drag the family name back through the public mud of a media frenzy. By doing so, they effectively, intentionally sealed the mystery forever.
It is a remarkably ethical stance, which is a rarity in the true crime space. But it means the rest of us are left in the dark, which is exactly why the cultural legacy of Hinterkaifeck remains so massive and enduring. This case is essentially the historical blueprint for the rural thriller genre. It directly inspired Andrea Maria Schenkel's best-selling novel, Tenud. It has spawned numerous European films, documentaries, and endless late-night internet sleuthing. It is the ultimate locked-room mystery, set against an incredibly harsh, unforgiving rural backdrop.
It endures in the public consciousness because it taps into a deeply primal, universal fear. It is the fear of the isolated cabin, the fear of the unseen stranger standing in the dark. But the isolation of Hinterkaifeck wasn't just geographical, it was deeply, tragically psychological.
That is the part that truly sticks with me long after reading the files. Andreas Gruber was so tyrannical, so physically and emotionally abusive, and he alienated his family so deeply from the surrounding village that they were living on a deserted emotional island long before the killer ever stepped foot on the property. When a predator finally entered their ecosystem, they had absolutely no one to call. They had burned all their bridges. They had no allies. They were utterly, tragically alone in a fortress of their own making.
It is a profound tragedy of alienation. The thick physical walls of the Arnfristoff were built to keep the brutal winter out, but the psychological walls Andreas Gruber built kept any hope of rescue out as well.
As we wrap up this exploration, I want to pull us back from the CAD models, the forensic analysis, and the behavioral profiles. I want to bring you back to the visceral, quiet reality of that freezing Bavarian winter. You lock your doors at night. You check the latches on the windows. You feel safe because you are inside, and the unpredictable threats of the world are kept outside. But sometimes, the scariest mystery isn't the sudden violence at the end of the story. It's the terrifying realization that the danger had already moved in, breathing the same air as you, silently watching you from the shadows of your own home, long before anyone noticed. Next time, we examine one of Britain's most controversial murder convictions, where forensic evidence, disputed timelines, and decades of appeals continue to divide investigators and the public alike.